Families, the home learning environment and schools can all play an important role in helping to improve social mobility in the UK. That's why nurturing talent in the early years is a core focus of our work here at the Social Mobility Commission. I'm Resham Kotecha, Deputy Chair of the Social Mobility Commission, and on this episode of Social Mobility Talks, I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Davies, who is Policy Director at the Centre for Social Justice. Ed has had a varied and fascinating career. Before joining the CSJ, he spent 15 years in health policy as a journalist, editor, and a policy wonk. He also spent 2 years in government as an expert policy advisor to health secretaries from 2021 to 2023. So nothing like an easy 2 years in the health department. Ed, it would be great to hear about your role at the CSJ, about your work in education policy and your interest in social mobility as a wider cause. So could you just give us a little bit about yourself?
So yeah, the 15 years I spent as a journalist, 8 years clean now, so that's been good. We're sort of spent building up a knowledge base of what works in people's lives, and then moved to CSJ in 2016 to try and put some of that into practice and put it into government, and now looking at actually what can I glean from the evidence over those 15 years about education policy, about families and about what works. And so that's what we're trying to do day by day to help the government make a better country.
So Ed, could you set out a bit about the work you've been doing at the CSJ on early years, just to give us some context for the conversation we're about to have?
Yeah, so the Centre for Social Justice is essentially a poverty think tank, and we look at all different kinds of factors within poverty. And we have our 5 pathways, which are the main focus of what we do, which are around family, education, work, addiction and debt. And the reality is early years comes into all of those. It's sort of particularly you would think family, but also early years education. What does it mean to grow up in a workless household? How does addiction affect you in your early years, particularly in your parents? So it is a common thread through almost everything we do. And so we find ourselves sort of coming back to it time and time again in all sorts of different ways.
And could you just give us an overview as we start? What role does childcare play? I know that's something that people often think about when you talk about early years, as that's being the big issue. So what does that look like in the UK right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I think you're exactly right. When you think of family and children policy, you immediately go to childcare. And is it a good or bad thing? And I think it is so much more than that. And so the reality of going to something like childcare is, what is the effect? What does it look like? The answer is quite broad. It depends. Like, childcare can do all sorts of different things. Some of them really good, some of them really bad as well. And actually finding the nuance within that is quite important. So, for example, if we think of childcare as maybe the year preschool, if you do language-focused intensive, sort of maybe 4 mornings a week, you can get really good benefits in terms of language development. But what we're seeing at the moment, a lot of children going into sort of industrial childcare settings earlier and earlier, that can have quite long-term negative effects if it's low quality provision. And so it's sort of the thing people go to, but it can be a really good or bad thing depending on what the actual childcare is.
And so on that, because we at the SMC have quoted some findings previously that the most disadvantaged children are starting school 4.5 months behind their most advantaged peers, which by the time they get to GCSEs, that's widened to almost 18 months. So that 4.5 months feels key. How do we tackle that? And what do you see as being the primary contributor to that by the time a child starts school, if you're looking at early years childcare?
Yeah, there's 2 sides to it. So the half that we instinctively go to, probably because we work in government, is what can the government provide? And I think that's a very sort of obvious thing. You know, we talk about how we provide services and what policy looks like and all that side of things, which is really important. But the other side of it is home as well. Like, actually, how secure is a child's home? How secure are their relations, their attachments to their parents? How's their parents' relationship between each other? And actually that stuff has a massive, massive influence, probably bigger than anything the state can do. And so actually some of what the state can do is supporting that. It's saying not, we'll give you a service and we'll educate your child for you. It's actually, how's your relationship going? Like, actually, these early years are really, really tough. Having a small baby is an incredibly hard thing.
Yes.
You don't get a lot of sleep. You don't, and so actually the question is not, can we provide a service to take the baby away or take you away? It's actually, can we provide a service that says what the pressure points at the moment? What does that look like? Is it between you and your partner? Can we give you some help as much as can we give you help with the baby? And I think that home side of things is as important as the childcare side of things, and sometimes really gets lost in this.
And so when you're thinking about the support the government can give, I assume you get some of the pushback around nanny state or personal responsibility, or the risk of kind of blaming parents perhaps for the situation they might find themselves in terms of their capacity to care for the child. How do you deal with those challenges in a policy debate?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, keep it child-centric has to be the sort of the aim of this. I think one of the sort of foundations of the CSJ setup is how you sort of advocate for the most vulnerable. And in this situation, the most vulnerable person is a child who didn't ask to be there, who has no agency, who is, a less than 1-year-old often. What can we do that's in that child's interest, and how can we, as adults, take responsibility for that child? So I think that's a really important starting point. That is what the state is there for, to protect the vulnerable and the future citizens of this country. So I think part one, think about that is sort of the key. In terms of then going on from that, so much of it is a judgment call. Like, where should the state intervene or not intervene? So I did a couple of years in the Department of Health, and we had this, my entire time there was whether or not this smoking ban should come in. And people sort of come to me and say, should we do the smoking ban? So it's a judgment call. It really is. Smoking is very harmful. Liberty is really important. Somewhere there's going to be something in between. So those nanny state arguments around parenting and things are a judgment call. That said, I think we are in quite a uniquely difficult position at the moment in the UK. We have the most fragile families in the whole of Europe. We have now intergenerational sort of family breakdown, where actually people don't know how to parent because they weren't parented. We were doing some research in the Northwest recently, and we were doing a round table of young people looking at work, and they talked about being from families who are 5th and 6th generation out of work now. Wow. That actually we've got some really entrenched problems. And so, yes, it is a bit nanny state sometimes to intervene in people's lives, but also sometimes it might be the right thing to do. The question is how you do that well.
And I imagine it's very difficult to answer this question, but you talk about us being the most fragile in Europe in terms of family structure. What have you identified, or what are the root causes of that? And therefore, what are the problems we need to address and tackle?
Yeah, I mean, this is enormously sensitive stuff, and I'm conscious when I talk about it that we all have experience of it. But the reality of the last 50 years is we've gone from a situation where 50 years ago, 90% of children sitting their O-levels lived with their mum and dad, and it's about 50-50 now. And the effect that has on all different aspects of life, child and adolescent mental health services, physical health services, schools coping with this. So when that separation happens, it is disruptive to a child's life. What does that look like for teachers dealing with that over the course of a year or two during childhood? And I think we have sort of, because it is difficult and it's personal and it's sensitive, we're quite embarrassed to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And so we're not very good at saying, this is really important, it is happening, we have to talk about it. And I think once we've made that step and said, right, what can we do? Well, there's lots of things we can do. I think encouraging people to form committed relationships is a good sort of starting point before a child even enters the scene. But then things like, talking about a nanny state where you provide support, things like family hubs we have now, which are coming up where you can get all sorts of support. There's things like parenting courses, there are couple courses, there's breastfeeding classes, there's all sorts of different things you can find there that can just make those early years easier, so that when you have, and most kids are born to two parents, you make sure that around that intense period in the early years that they maybe make it through that time with two parents.
That sounds great. And as someone sleep deprived, I am finding our local family hub and childcare support very helpful. But you've mentioned family hubs, and obviously people who are around or have heard of it or are interested in the policy area will also have heard of Sure Start. Can you explain a bit about the differences, and are there lessons from Sure Start that we or you are taking into account in your research, or that we should be thinking about when we think about how government could support these families?
Yeah. So that early years support is really important, and I don't think we've definitely got everything right yet, but I think we're on the right road. So Sure Start came along under the Blair government. To be honest, the evaluations were quite mixed. Some of them seemed to show some good things, some of them showed bad. Each Sure Start was very different in every area. It's very hard. There's no counterfactual either. I can't tell you that this family would have gone down one direction, but Sure Start saved them, because you don't know what would have happened to that family. You've only got what happened. You can sort of put in control groups and what have you, but it's quite hard to evaluate. But we do know that actually some interventions do make a difference. There were some things that seemed to be good, particularly actually for the parents as much as the children. It's in Sure Start that actually mothers in particular appreciated. Actually, I think it was probably just the relationships they built through their Sure Start centre, and they got a bit of a reputation at the time for being a bit middle class. But actually, what that meant was people were turning up, and actually you did have that bit of mix, and so there was something in that that's quite important. I think then, so those were sort of phased out under the Cameron government, and you saw then the growth of family hubs. I think there are a lot of similarities. Family hubs have picked up a lot of the children's centres as part of what they do, but the major difference is family hubs tend to go right up the age range. As the name suggests, you will find that there are support things for all kinds of different ages and stages within family life, right up sort of 19, I think even 25 in some of the family hubs for children with various special needs. So it's a bit more of a holistic approach. It's also less of a sort of physical place. So Sure Start centres tended to be a thing that you go to, whereas family hubs tend to be a network of organisations helping families in all sorts of different ways. It's fairly early days, so we've done a recent analysis of them that seems to show they are doing the right sort of things in the right directions. They've picked up some of the good stuff from Sure Start. I think actually the really big question right now is more a political one than a policy one. Just in the budget just gone, they announced a 1-year rollover of funding for family hubs, but there's a big conversation at the moment around whether to resurrect Sure Start or what this should look like. And so at the moment we're sort of in this stasis of, can we get funding rolled over for 3 years, 5 years to double down on this? I think probably the biggest mistake we could make is to do exactly what happened in 2010, scrap it and try and start all over again. Actually, if you want to sort of slightly change family hubs as you go, great, but there does need to be some sort of provision.
And so just to pull back, because you talked about the recent government announcement in the budget, but equally earlier in the year or last year perhaps, there was an announcement from the previous government about changes to childcare provision. And we are in the UK one of the, if not the most expensive for childcare provision in the whole of Europe. So what do you think about those recent changes across governments?
Yeah,
what's helping, what's not? What would you like to see done differently?
Yeah. There's the sort of PG version of how I feel about this, and then the 18 version of how I feel about it. I think the PG version is employment's really important, and this is an intervention that is focused on getting people into the workforce. And I know that economic growth is an important part of what we do, but we have to accept there will be downsides to this. The less PG version is, I do really worry about where the entire developed world is going on childcare. I think the increasing body of evidence is that attachment to parents, particularly in the first couple of years, is incredibly important and has very, very, very serious long-term outcomes. And yet, pretty much every developed nation in the world is following this. We need high GDP employment. And so now we are talking about 30 hours of institutional childcare for a 9-month-old child, in the knowledge not only that it's probably not great for the child, but actually it's not what the majority of parents want either. And so we have started to go down this road to quite a serious degree, where we are doing something that is harmful to children, that is not wanted by parents. And it is one of those underlying things where a lot of people are disengaging from politics because it simply says it doesn't serve me. We've done a lot of polling of new parents, and almost in every poll I've ever seen, you're looking at about 70% who would like to spend more time with children under the age of 2. And yet every direction of government is saying you're going to spend less time with your child under the age of 2. And then we act surprised that people aren't having children. We're sort of providing this sort of structure, this economy that actually doesn't value child rearing and being parents. And so I think we do need to have a bit of a pause on some of the changes that are going on. And like I say, it's not just the government gone, it's the current government, it's the government across a lot of Western nations who are understandably seeking the growth of GDP, but probably know the cost of everything and the value of very little.
I love that you talk about the unrecognised cost of child rearing, because it's amazing since starting maternity leave how many people will say things, men and women, will say things like, so you have a year off work. Or, and you kind of think, well, actually, this is the hardest, most tiring thing ever. I do feel envious sometimes when my husband goes to work, because I'm like, you know how to do that. You understand how to do that. And this in some ways feels very hard. And so I think actually a conversation I never hear is about how do we make it actually financially possible for people to have children. When you look at statutory maternity pay, that's very challenging, especially with the cost of living at the moment, or in recent years, to manage. And I don't think we've seen much research or policy recommendations on how to shift it so that we can have a birth rate that means the UK can replace itself without relying solely on immigration.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. And I think there are a few elements. I mean, this is going slightly down a sort of a different road now, talking about birth rates and things. But that is a really significant thing. I mean, the birth rate, I think just last week it was announced about 1.4 something now in the UK. So you're talking about a 30% shrink generation on generation now. And so we will have to have really difficult conversations about what that means for an ageing society, what that means for pension ages, what that means for migration, and these things all interact with each other. And if we can't make a sort of pro-family nation, then we will have to talk about raising the pension age, we will have to talk about higher migration. And those are difficult choices, and choices we will have to make. Yeah.
So let's put it back to childcare then, because I did want to ask you, you said there were some good and some bad outcomes of childcare. So when the CSJ is doing its research, what do you define as childcare? Is that anyone other than the primary carer? Does that count as grandparents, childminders, nurseries? Just let's set out what we're actually talking about.
I mean, it's a great question, and you are talking about a million different variations, you really are. So you're talking different by age and by provider and all sorts of things. So childcare could just be caring for a child. It could be as a parent, you caring for your child, and actually is it best provided by the parent? I would say certainly the evidence is certainly the first year, almost universally, it is best provided by the parent. That's where the evidence goes. Year 1 to 2, almost universally better provided by the parent, but actually in really chaotic households and difficult backgrounds, some external support does appear to help as well. It's also, by the time we're talking about the end of year 1, actually for most people you can't be at home all the time, and so the reality is you then think, okay, what is the next best? It seems to be the evidence is that actually a close friend, a grandparent or something like that is the next best thing. The next best thing is sort of institutionalised childcare, but with as low a proportion of children to workers as possible. So there is a sort of gradation, and it's important to say as well, I think sometimes because you say something is the best that everything else is bad, it's not. There's a sort of grey and there's a reality, and we all live in reality, and I can say, wouldn't it be great if we all had ages to spend with our children? But we do also have to earn money and have jobs, and that's really good too. So.
And when you say best or better, how are you measuring that? What are the outcomes by which you're determining the impact of this childcare?
Yeah, so sort of a range of child outcomes is normally what we'd look at. So we'd look at sort of things as the child grew up, like mental health problems. We'd look at how they get on at school, exam results, things like that. The extreme end, you might look at criminality, sort of whether a child is involved in crime. There are some quite interesting studies. There was one in Quebec, which is quite widely cited, where they had in the 1990s, they put out a very, very broad childcare offer, but they reduced the quality quite severely as a result. And 18 years down the line measured it and found there were some really quite serious consequences to mental health and criminality and things like that. So all those different child outcomes down the line you would want to look at. I think there is also there's a really difficult sort of part to touch on or measure or understand in childcare that parents feel but they can't necessarily quantify. And part of the reason that people love having their grandparents look after the child is they know the grandparent loves their child. Mm-hmm. And there's something about the professionalisation of childcare and child services, which is really important. You need well-qualified people. But parents can't really quantify, but they can feel if someone actually loves and cares for their child. And that is really, really important. They want to know that this most important thing in their life is cared for. And I think because we can't quantify that, we sometimes forget it. But it means that people don't behave rationally. Like you can say, this leaver does this and we give you this amount of money and this person is that qualified. And then parents look at the offer and go, I'm not sure this person loves my child. And I don't want to leave them with someone who doesn't love my child. And so there are those intangibles that get in there as well. And it's really hard to measure how much someone loves your child. Of course. But you instinctively know that it matters.
So coming on to that, the money, because your recent report had some really great suggestions. I particularly love the front loading of benefits one, but could you just set out the recommendations so we can get into them in a bit more detail?
Yeah, I think, hopefully what I've sort of illustrated so far by my sort of garbled movement around this area is it's really complicated. And so the guiding principle of this paper is essentially to trust parents. It's that actually, as well as all the quantifiables, there are the unquantifiables, and that parents tend to know best. And we can say, a child up to the age of 2 will probably be better at home, and then after 2 they probably need some socialisation. But every parent knows their child is different. So that's the sort of guiding principle, is how do we put parents in control? And we looked at, is there a sort of cost-neutral way that we can put parents in control of this situation? So we had 3 principles behind it. The first one is transferable tax allowances. It's fairly simple. If you want to send out one parent to work and the other stay at home, can we help that somehow? The second part is this front loading of child benefit, as you mentioned, which is something the CSJ has looked at for quite a long time actually, and is that is the big move in this. And then the third part was whether some of the vouchers and things that we give for childcare now could be given as cash, so that parents could decide, actually, is it better for me to pay a grandparent or something like that to help out? If they have travel costs, can I give them a bit of money to help get here, or whatever that may be? The really big change that is within that is a sort of 10 billion sum of money, is the front loading of child benefits the first 4 years we've suggested there. And that is to try and acknowledge that actually that is when poverty peaks, that is when family breakdown peaks, that is when the pressures are really, really intense. It's not to say they aren't intense when you have teenagers. There are different pressures. And I have 2 myself at home, and they provide all sorts of joys and what have you. But that financial pressure tends to be most acute in those first 4 years. And by the time, you have teenagers, you are able to go out and work a bit more. You are able to leave them by themselves a bit more. They do have longer school days, etc. So can we say, okay, we're going to have winners and losers here within the existing financial package, give the most support to the people that need it most, and that will tend to be in the early years where you'll see the best results.
So I imagine some people would raise concerns about the chaotic families you've referenced, the most disadvantaged, the ones who have not been parented themselves and therefore might not understand or be capable of the type of parenting decisions or provision that we would hope for. How would your proposals support those children who are living in disadvantaged homes, the ones with the least support and the least the least access to the village around them, so to speak?
So I think there is the childcare proposal itself, which would hopefully take some of the financial pressure off the table. It would say, okay, you're going to have a lot of pressures because having young children is a nightmare. However rich you are, it's just tough. But hopefully we can just reduce the financial pressure. So that's the first side of it, that you won't be as squeezed. You might still be squeezed, but you won't be as squeezed. The second part of it is not really part of the childcare package. It is some of that family hubs type stuff we mentioned. What are the other things in the area? One of the things about family hubs is they are targeted at areas of deprivation, and you don't want to make them too exclusive or stigmatizing, but actually if you can just make them available in areas where they will be of most use, then you'll find they have the greatest effect, is the theory behind them at the moment. And so there is an element of, we can't necessarily solve all that problem just through the payment mechanism, so we do have to make sure there are going to be things outside the payment mechanism that do address that.
And our State of the Nation report, so we produce one every year. We just released ours, laid it before Parliament earlier this year. We focused a lot on place, so I'm really pleased to hear you talk about the challenges across place, because too often you see policy proposals that treat the United Kingdom as uniform without recognising the infrastructure and economic challenges in different places. So when you look at your work on the most disadvantaged children in early years, what more can the government do that isn't around the tax and benefit system to support children where the geographical issue is the biggest challenge?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably the biggest challenge facing the UK for 100 years now, and the levelling up agenda was sought to address this, but Heseltine tried to do this too. You've had this for a long time, and I don't think we've got to the bottom of it yet. I think there is this sort of economic and family two sides of the same coin. Like, actually, you need work, you need good jobs, you need employment, and that helps underpin family life. And when you don't have those, the two spiral. And so I do think there is an element of, it gets quite a long way from families and childcare, but it is, how do you economically redevelop parts of the country? And this goes to totally different areas of the CSJ's work. I mean, we talk about that on a different podcast, but that is really important too. That actually, if you don't have the means to support your family in a good job, well, then your family will struggle. And so actually that levelling up, that can we build, whatever it may be, scientific clusters? Can we get different parts of the country working together? Can we get some of the things outside London? I mean, the centricity of London in the UK is quite unusual now compared to most international centres. Is there some way we can maybe pull a bit more out of London and around the country? And I think that is a bit of $1 million question, and I think it probably, as with the childcare proposals that we've put together, there has to be sacrifices. I think there's something in politics that says, no, everyone can be a winner and we'll do this thing, and and it's only the sunny uplands ahead. It's like, no, if you want to make big change, explain the sacrifice you are willing to make that change happen. So in the case of this childcare package, we've said, yeah, if you have children who are teenagers, you're going to lose out. You're going to lose out by thousands of pounds a year. But we think that matters less than helping families with very small children. And I think similarly, the conversation that we're not having around levelling up is that necessarily some industries will probably have to move elsewhere around the country at some point.
Because I'm right in thinking your proposals are almost neutral to the Treasury.
They are completely cost neutral.
In such a way to make them so.
So yeah, the idea is, I'm really conscious that this is a government with very little money. And so the most help we can do is to find cost neutral ways of approaching things like child poverty in early years. And finding that there is, the government still spends £1 trillion. We can spend £1 trillion better, I think. And so rather than going with a begging bowl and saying give more money to this or that, it's how can we take the money we've got and do it better, and this does that. But to do that, you have to accept that you will be taking from Peter to feed Paul.
Okay, so we've got the money and we've got 3 great proposals here. But aside from money, because obviously, as you say, other than redistributing the money we're spending, there isn't just an endless money tree, sadly. So you talked about some of the early years things you can do to make changes. Did you see a kind of commonality in groups where that isn't being done, whether that's reading to children? We ran a parenting campaign about the importance of reading to children in the first year. But where do you see the non-financial changes that could be made to support early years?
I think one of the things I would love to see more is a focus on dads. I think often when we think about early years, we think about mums and babies. But actually, there are lots of dads out there too. And this is an area that we've looked at quite a lot at CSJ, but actually I did antenatal classes for dads for 15 years. And it's pathetic how grateful they are, to be honest. We would go and run these sessions and we would talk about the birth itself, but then we would talk about the next 18 years. And I got involved because when I had a child, it was terrifying and useless, and a friend of mine said, I run these courses, let's do them for other dads. So we worked in Kingston Hospital, Chelsea and Westminster, sort of around southwest London. And we would get 50 guys in a room and we would talk to them about, this is what the next 18 years of your life look like. Like, let's lay this out and now talk to each other about how you're going to deal with this. And at the end, it wasn't that we did anything particularly sort of miraculous or wonderful. We mostly got them to talk to each other about it. But there was so little acknowledgement of you have an active role as a father, that there just wasn't much else out there. And I think there is a real opportunity there. Like, most children are born to two parents who want the best for them. And if you can engage the second one a bit more in life, then much the better. So things like that, like antenatal courses, I mean, that cost nothing. I mean, we did it as a volunteer charity and one of the midwives volunteered her time. It's a tiny moment, but actually in the life of a father, it is a really key point where just to sit down for a couple of hours and say, let's just think about the next 18 years, or 26.
Absolutely.
26 is the average age that the child leaves home now. So,
oh wow.
Yes.
Well, I won't embarrass anyone by saying how much older than that I was when I left. But I do think, I mean, what you say about the father is important, because I do take real umbrage, as does my husband, when people make jokes about daddy daycare, because he's kind of like, I'm not babysitting, this is my baby. But we still, as a society, view it very much as a responsibility of the mother, whether she is the primary carer or not. And I think, there's a lot of research on the importance of the dad. And what they can do for the child.
Around things like language development, actually, dads have a really unique role to play. It's one of those slightly strange things that women tend to talk down to babies so they understand them, and men tend to talk to babies like short adults, and they use longer words and longer phrases. And so it tends to help language development, and things like that are really important, and they're sort of well established now in the sort of research literature. And so engaging dads, and some of it doesn't cost a penny. It's cultural as well. It's when you write as the NHS to the mum, I understand where phrases like non-birthing partner come from, but if you can write to the dad and say you're a dad, like,
absolutely
engage, then that's a really powerful moment in his life as well.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thank you. And then I want to just bring us to nursery for a minute, because when we are, there's a lot of kind of formal, institutionalised provision of childcare, and obviously different providers and different ways of treating that. Do you at the CSJ look at that type of provision and kind of best practice, or how you can improve nurseries that aren't doing as well? And I assume the teachers and I assume there's a place-based impact there too.
Yeah, definitely. I think when you talk about childcare, you're talking about a sort of holistic nurturing, often very human relational attachment type thing. By the time you get to that sort of year or so preschool, you are talking about language development. It's definitely sort of play-based and things like that as well. It's still, a very informal environment, but there's a decent amount of literature to say there are specific things you can do that will help the child to be school ready in that last year or so before school. And I think that is really important to get right. A few of them, again, are sort of staff ratios, staff training, making sure it's high quality. The danger is if it's low quality, that can be really damaging. And I think there has to be a sort of honesty within the system as well to say whether this is high or low quality, and almost with parents to say, yeah, if you're putting your child in this place, this might be great for work, and that is a good in itself. It might help you work, but don't expect this to be good for your child. If we can make it be good for the child as well, that would be the best thing by a very, very long way. Indeed, I would argue probably more important it's good for the child than that you go to work. But making sure that we're not sort of hoodwinking ourselves about that actually, if it's poor quality nursery provision, actually it can be quite damaging.
And so other than nursery provision, we used to have a lot of childminders, and that peaked in the late 90s in terms of numbers of childminder provision. Obviously, changes to kind of laws and regulations means the number of au pairs has fallen. Do you have views on alternative childcare provision and what we could be doing as a country to increase alternative provision?
So it does come a bit back to that. There are sort of best, better sort of grades of good practice, and actually there's some really interesting research about attachment actually that says children who make good attachments to their grandparents as much as their parents can have really good outcomes. But it is that having that sort of stable, focused attention with an adult that really seems to matter. And I think so that some of that one-on-one au pairs, childminders, things like that is great if you can get it, but it's not cheap. And that's the sort of the reality. And actually what you tend to find in poorer communities is they try and replicate that through friendships, through sort of, they refer to them as aunts and uncles maybe, who aren't aunts and uncles at all, but just sort of close family friends. And they will do that at sort of mates costs and things like that. And I think that is a really healthy thing to be encouraged, the building of community, particularly in those early years. And you'll find if you do need to work, and it is really important to have work in a household as well. Like they're slightly at tension, so you mustn't forget that. But if you do need to go out and work, that actually knowing that the person, again going back, in tangible love and care is someone who is in their lives is a really good thing. And so coming back to what the government can do about that, it comes back to why we put this proposal forward. It's you put power and money in the hands of the parents so that they can use it as they see fit. And that may be to pay a sort of informal auntie or uncle. It may be so that they can stay at home, or it may be formal childcare or a nursery, or but it puts the parents in control of what is best for the child.
Okay, that's super helpful. So now I'd like to ask just one potentially tricky, potentially fun question. If you were Prime Minister for the day, assuming you've already implemented your 3 proposals, what would you do, whether that's education, health, mental health, kind of tax changes? What would you do if you had one day to sort out early years and make sure we're kind of broadening the field, making sure that disadvantaged children especially could get that leg up and achieve that social mobility?
So I said at the beginning, there is sort of 2 sides to this. There is what government can do and what we choose to do in our own lives. And I think the thing of that latter, what we choose to our own lives, has changed completely in 50 years. I mean, really, for thousands of years, it was basically the same. And in the last 50 years, it's completely changed. And this will feel like a boring technical point, but we should measure it more. Like, we don't really fully understand the impact this is having on the whole of society at the moment, and yet it has fundamentally changed society. It has changed the way our education system works. It has changed everything from our health provision, our mental health provision, our police services. Everything has changed as a result. And we look at things like the budget this week, where we are trying to raise billions and billions of pounds for a health service, which is being impacted by this change in the social fabric. And so it is boring to say just measure it, but can we just measure it?
Don't worry, we're not bored. We love data and evaluation at the SMC. We do a lot of work on what the government should do on better data, because if you measure it, it can be managed, and if not, you have no idea whether it's working or not.
I mean, this is what gets measured gets done in government. And at the moment, that family structure piece, it's so personal and sensitive and difficult to address that unless we're standing on absolutely solid numbers, I don't think anyone really can address it. Mm-hmm. And so understanding, what does this look like in schools? It's really hard, and we might not like what we find, but we absolutely can't address it until we know what's going on.
And what's the biggest pushback you feel? I mean, I assume people who are kind of more ideologically left of centre or ideologically right of centre come at it with different viewpoints, different criticisms, different challenges. Where do you feel those biggest pushbacks are on the 2 sides?
I think when we talk about family structure at the CSJ, I am really conscious that the pushback we get is this feels Victorian and moralising, and you're from another age, and things like that. And we've got to be honest about that. I know that is how it feels to some people. And, some of my best friends are going through divorces at the moment. And so I know this is hard and personal. But if we don't even know what the effect is of this enormous social change, there's nothing we can do about it. And so it comes back to, can we just measure this? Can we properly understand what's happening? And then we can make the decision to do nothing. But I suspect when we understand the effect that it's having on children, we might say, okay, how do we rectify this? How do we take a slight deviation of course back to something else?
So the SMC released a report, The Childhood Origins of Social Mobility, and according to that data, around 40% of girls from the more disadvantaged backgrounds said they felt nervous and lost confidence. And we saw similar for boys, significantly more boys from less advantaged backgrounds saying they didn't have self-esteem, they felt like they lacked confidence, which obviously then goes on to track with lower economic and educational outcomes, undermatching when it comes to jobs. So given these are some of the issues that trend through later in life, what can we do in the early years to help support some of those, I guess, harder to measure, I mean, we've tried, but harder to measure, slightly intangible outcomes of how you feel about yourself?
Yeah. So going right through our work at the CSJ, I would say we work with hundreds of small charities, and they work on sort of ways to address poverty. But when you actually talk to them, almost everything they do is about relationships. It is all relational. It doesn't really matter if if someone's been out of work for a while and they're trying to get back into a job. The thing that will make the difference is having a good, trusted relationship. The same as at the beginning of life. If you want to give a child confidence, who are the good, trusted relationships in their life? Who are the people who are going to have their back, who are going to champion them? When you look at, it's interesting you mentioned there around sort of girls with low confidence. It's almost sort of a cliche to talk about father issues, but there is a real thing. Do you have this man in your life who's got your back? And that makes this enormous difference. And so to the point, if you don't, how can we get that for you? How can we make sure there is someone in your life with your back? So it's one of those sort of universal things to think about, both in terms of getting into work, age 30. Do you have that? But it's the same for kids. Do they have those relationships that will give them confidence, that they know someone's got their back, that they can try stuff and fail? And the real sort of the basic biological stuff in this, it comes right back to attachment. It comes right back to those first few years, that the more secure that child feels in their early years, the more in their life they are able to go out and take risks and try stuff, because they feel secure to come back to their base. And that doesn't really change. It starts age 0, but actually it still applies age 30, that if I have that secure base to come back to, I can go out in the world and take risks, and that's all relationships.
Great. Well, I love that we're ending on relationships. So, Ed, thank you, because this has been absolutely fascinating. So, for people listening or watching, if they're interested in more of the work you're doing, is there anything you've got coming up they should be looking out for, or are we just letting them know that we're sharing the links to your report on letting families take the credit?
Yeah, you can find all reports on our website. We've got some, for people interested in this space, we will have some big reports coming out in the next couple of months on mental health. Obviously, that is a big thing at the moment in children in particular, but right across the population. And if you're particularly interested in some of our sort of more difficult, tricky topics, we're going to be looking at addiction in the next couple of weeks, and the effect that has on lives and families and things as well. So those two big ones are coming up.
Great, so lots for people to read, and we'll be linking Give Families the Credit and a number of our SMC research reports and policy recommendations in the comments below this. So Ed, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure and privilege to hear from you about your work and some of the recommendations you're making. I hope that the Chancellor and Prime Minister will take those into account as they think about upcoming policy recommendations. Thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to watch further episodes of the Social Mobility Talks podcast, where we discuss a huge range of social mobility topics, you can do so by following us on all platforms. If you've enjoyed the episode, please do share it and help us spread the word. We're also very keen for people to leave a rating on Spotify or a like on YouTube. You can also subscribe to make sure that you never miss an episode. Thank you very much.